Under the surface of jazz. And this is the great Sonny Red. And he's another great sax player with a nice bright tone. Wynton Kelly appears on this record, who's one of the great rhythm and blues jazz players of all time. Sam Jones is the bass player on most of it. Paul Chambers sits on a track. And then Jimmy Cobb and Roy Brooks take turns on the drums as well. Sonny was a powerful guy. He seems simpatico with a lot of what the tenor and tone of the times were, and he seems just to have a wonderful bluesy take on the hard bop sound. And he's a great improviser and just has a lot of narration to his playing. Like, he's explaining things. He's letting us know what his gut's telling him. Fantastic album cover. It's funny how other labels try this type of minimalism, this type of modernity, and just fail. Blue Note album titles, the Reed Miles, the font choices, the sans serif, lack of any kind of decorative fonts, just the simplicity. This is a cover that you show this to somebody, especially if you take that Blue Note logo off of there. This could have came out yesterday, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 40 years ago. It's ubiquitous. It's just so omnipresent. And at the time, this was very cutting edge. The Blue Note art department is so underappreciated as much as we appreciate it. And again, this could be a Billy Corgan solo record. You know what I mean? This could be Brian Eno's new album. This could be Roxy, anything. It's just so limitless what these covers are. And yet within the jazz landscape, they seem to make a certain sense. There seems to be this foundation of the blues and the space of the improvisation and the atmosphere above. It's, again, that's just one loose interpretation, but it's just somehow works. It's impressive. And looking at the Savoy stuff as we did earlier in the week, that stuff is all so dated. Even the covers you like, it's still very dated, and you wouldn't see it on a record today. And yet, a lot of Blue Note titles. Again, another great cover. The art is just really stands the test of time. Like few other labels can really claim credit to. And when they lost Reed Miles in '67 at the sale, to me, it was one of the last nails in the Blue Note coffin. You know, the sale happens, Reed Miles moves on, Alfred loses some of the control, and while still good music is made, Blue Note as we know it doesn't exist post that sale. It's just a different beast. And the more you know the Blue Note canon, the more you can just feel and see the changes. True Blue, again, Tina Brooks. I think he might have been a Pittsburgh native. I did an episode on him probably last spring. We've talked a lot of jazz since last spring. A lot of what I learned, it's hard to retain. But you often left with impressions of what you remembered learning. But Tina was a great player. We talked about him a minute ago. Again, he was haunted by a drug addiction, and this record was buried by Freddie Hubbard's release, which was kind of sad because, again, he had another record back on the tracks that was sitting ready to go that got pushed aside and never came out. It was even assigned a number, and it doesn't come out till quite a long time later. Freddie Hubbard's on this along with Duke Jordan, Sam Jones, and Art Taylor. This is actually pretty firmly in the Blue Note canon at this point. And again, it's so hard to define the Blue Note canon because virtually all of it has really got a real retentive part of nature to it. It just stays current somehow. But this is still part of the Blue Note sound. And so, unlike some of the J.J. Johnson stuff and the Bud Powell stuff and even Grasham Mancour or some of that later stuff, there's a Blue Note finite sound that comes in the middle where that core is. And Tina's definitely a part of that, which elevates this record's status for me and for a lot of collectors. Speaking of that core, one of the most underappreciated guys in the Blue Note canon, but even in the jazz canon, is Horace Silver. And I think it's really a shame. Horace Silver was an integral part of the Jazz Messengers. He and Art Blakey were the founders. As much as Blakey is the signature of hard bop and propels and drives it with that great drumming of his, it was kind of codified melodically and structurally wise and rhythmically by Horace Silver. And again, there's guys before, like Clifford Brown Max Roach Quintet was kind of that bridge to hard bop. But if you want to know what hard bop is, Horace Silver is one of the great understanding principles about it. He slows it down, he puts a little more groove and melody, he states themes of songs so you know what's going on. He plays with a great melodic sense. He has half of the original Jazz Messengers go with him when he first leaves in '56. And so Doug Watkins and Hank Mobley, those cats kind of follow him into his early works as Horace Silver. But Silver's group kind of reconvenes, and by 1959-60, Junior Cook and Blue Mitchell is the horn section, and Gene Taylor and Roy Brooks are the bass and drums. I always forget those two names. They stay with Silver for a long time. I should be better at remembering those two guys. But Junior Cook and Blue Mitchell have a wonderful rapport, and of course part of that it comes from playing with each other for a long time. There's a joy to Silver's compositions, a joy of life, a joy of food, drink, and woman. They have a very a good time feel. And Art Blakey's work with the Messengers becomes more potent, more militant, more African, culturally driven, and looks at our roots in the old continent. There's a lot of tones to what the Blakey and the Jazz Messengers are talking about. And Silver, it always feels it's more about women drinking wine. You know, women drink food, celebration, some gospel. It just has a real good time feel to it. And Brooks and Cook just are these great complementary pieces, a bit like when you hear Charlie Rouse play with Monk. They just fit. I love Horace Silver, and there's just not enough people out there singing the praises of the great man, whose career went on forever. One of the unheralded players at Blue Note is a guy by the name of Ike Quebec. And Ike Quebec did some recordings with Blue Note in the late 40s, early 50s as singles. And they were always meant to be a little more crossover, almost early soul jazz if you think about it. They had some R&B sensibility, some kind of pop song shape to them. And he was a great lyrical player from the Dexter Gordon, Ben Webster, Coleman Hawkins school. So he's firmly in that big, brushy, wonderfully eloquent sound of the tenor. So Ike Quebec was a giant, but he never really caught on as an album guy, and Alfred Lion was scared to kind of give him that kind of freedom and that range. He became an A&R talent scout for Blue Note and helped bring some pretty big names to the label. He had some health issues, and I can't remember if it was a drug or a drinking problem, but he had some health issues. He finally convinces Alfred Lion to allow him to do some albums again. And in like 1959, 1960, he makes 4 records for Blue Note that are awesome. They're awesome. They're a bit of a precursor to the Stanley Turner team. You know, they're full of wonderful swing, great melodic sensibility, a relaxed phrasing and timing. Just an older cat sitting on a park bench watching the birds eat seeds, you know, watching the squirrels play. He's clever, he's wry, he's witty, he's romantic. He plays the ballads as good as Ben Webster. Just a wonderful, dreamy ballad player. There's a lot of Ben Webster right there. You know, Dexter Gordon. Quebec is in that league. His 4 Blue Notes have become cherished landmarks for the deep Blue Note heads. And the Avantgarde guys are like, oh, I don't really like Ike Quebec. Good. Let's let people who dig music have them, because they're great records. They're so enjoyable. It might as well be Spring is fantastic. Blue and Sentimental is fantastic. The Bossa Nova record's absolutely brilliant. And then, of course, Heavy Soul is a landmark to me. It's just one of the first Blue Notes that I listened to endlessly. When I bought this, I just couldn't stop playing it. Again, great classic Reed Miles design. His Bossa Nova record is just a beautiful session that sadly happens right before his death. And he passes away, opening up the chair to Duke Pearson to start doing the A&R work at Blue Note. But Freddie Roach is on the organ, along with the great Milt Hinton and Al Harewood. Milt Hinton's a guy I love dearly. Speaking of the Bossa Nova, Charlie Rouse, who we spoke about a little bit earlier, he's actually playing with Monk at this point. But he gets a record contract to make a Bossa Nova record with Blue Note. And the Bossa Nova's exploded. And labels like Pacific and Contemporary and, of course, Verve, Impulse, all these labels are doing record after record of Bossa Nova. And Blue Note only does a couple. It wasn't really within the Blue Note sound. And Ike Quebec gets one, and it's a great record. But Charlie Rouse gets one. Tenor sax, Charlie Rouse, Bossa Nova Bacchanal. And tough record to come by. It's got some Caribbean, Latin players on it. Willie Bobo, Potato Valdez, Conga, Garvin Massot, Shakere, Kenny Burrell, and Chauncey Lord Westbrook. I don't know who Chauncey Westbrook is. Larry Gales is on the bass. Another record that I played a lot. When I'm not in the mood for heavy, I like the Bossa Nova sometimes just to be springy and light and a break from the oppression and the tyranny of Black America. America's a heavy rat to think on. And so when this takes you to Rio and the beaches of Ipanema and Conquistador and the Sugarloaf, and you just think of the wonderful Pan Am flight over top of Rio de Janeiro and the beautiful waves and the sunshine, to me, jazz gives us that break with the Bossa Nova. And it doesn't have to be an oppressive, dark look into the guts of America when we're doing this. We can wiggle some sand between our toes, and it's healthy to have a break sometimes for all of us. Speaking of Garvin Massot, picking my favorite Grant Green record, or even just picking a Grant Green record, for me is really difficult, because I really like Grant Green's body of work. He pretty much has a couple formulas, and one's where he plays a little bit more rhythm and blues with piano player and a quartet, once in a while the quintet, but he doesn't often have horns on his records at all. But then his other settings often with an organ player, and that'll often be just a trio, just the guitar, organ, and drums. And I like Grant Green's entire discography, especially up until the funk stuff. And I still like the funk stuff, and I play it as a DJ quite a lot because it's fun to play. It's been sampled. But in my home space, my own headspace, Grant Green's 60s work for me is just wonderful. A Greater Walk with God here, Feeling the Spirit, Herbie Hancock, Butch Warren, Billy Higgins, and Garvin Massot. It's just a wonderful session. They're doing kind of gospel soul songs, as it were. Just Closer Walk with Thee, Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen, go down Moses. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. It's fun to hear Herbie Hancock in a very straightforward setting. There's not a lot of room here for him to be modern or compositional. You know, he just is playing the standard, which all great players need to be able to do that. You know, all great players need to be able to sit back and allow the piece to dictate how I play. And I think that's some of the trouble with some of the avant-garde guys is some of them have a hard time playing the core of the piece. But again, I love Grant Green's body of work pretty much from stem to stern, and I just chose this one because it's one I haven't featured as much as Idle Moments or Green Street, Street of Dreams. There's you can't go wrong. You can't go wrong with Grant Green. And in a lot of ways, the soul jazz movement, Grant Green kind of takes that torch from Jimmy Smith. And Jimmy Smith doesn't start out as soul jazz. And Jimmy Smith, in some ways, isn't really soul jazz. He's very much a hard bopper, bebopper in the early days. But his organ becomes a bit more commercialized as the 60s come along. They start doing a few more pop songs in the mix. And then when he goes to Verve, it really codifies itself and becomes soul jazz and organ jazz. But at Blue Note, Grant Green kind of takes that torch and becomes the body of soul jazz. And two of the elements that really define soul jazz, especially come mid-60s, is the guitar and the organ. And all those great Jack McDuff records, even Kenny Burrell's doing stuff in that vein at that point. It just has this great Shirley Scott stuff, Stanley Turner stuff. It's just got this wonderful gospel, barbecue sauce inflected. We're going to go to church then. We're going to get some chicken, and we're going to go back to church. And we had a church back in the day, my dad was a pastor, that was right next to a chicken shack. And so we get buckets of chicken that would come over into the church all the time for post-sermon meals. And it was always just kind of a fun celebration. So I've always liked the chicken in church kind of analogy. It's a barbecue. We got some potato salad, we got some coleslaw. Let's mix it up. Wash your fingers before you touch the drum set, kids. You know, that's some of my better memories of church, to be honest. Most of my memories of church ain't very positive. You know, most of the exclusivity of these little cultish groups for me, it's hard for me to grasp why the creator would choose one group and exclude everybody else. My God reveals himself to all people equally and loves all of his creation the same. And I'm guessing that we all got his name wrong. I just can't grasp from my global mindset how, and when I say global mindset, as a young kid being force-fed religion, I dove into atlases. I studied countries and history and started to know the movements of the lines on the map and why Africa looked like this in 1960 but looked like this in 1980 and it looked like this in 1880. Like, you start to see those movements of the lines and how wealth and power dictate those lines, and it all starts to change your perspectives on nations, peoples, cultures, migrations, and things. And the broader my understanding of it all became, the broader my empathy for all people grew. And I think in a lot of ways that determines your politics, is how broad is your empathy. If I'm only interested in me and my group or my family or my race or my nation, a lot of the policies that I defend make sense. I don't care what happens to people in Africa. It's not my concern. But if you do care about people in Africa, you realize what they're oppressed by is corporate interests, exploiting resources, starting civil wars and conflicts, toppling governments and regimes, creating mad inflation, destroying economics. A lot of that broader knowledge and empathy is what creates my political landscape. And if your landscape is narrow, it's going to keep your political view narrow and who you care about, the well-being of. But if you care about the welfare and well-being of all people, you can't believe in certain political viewpoints, because that's never going to make things better for everybody. And until we do, war, injustice, disease, starvation are all manifestations of our inequality. And that's a truth that I feel like we cannot escape. George Braith is an interesting player, a bit like a Rashawn Roland Kirk. He's a multi-horn player. He can blow into 3 horns at once. It's a bit of a novelty thing because you're trying to create chords with your playing. And with chords, you're creating harmonics, but you're abandoning melodic forward movement at times. Instead of him playing one horn and playing melodic lines, he's playing these harmonic chords. And I like his records, but as I've grown older, I've found it's a bit of a novelty thing. And when Grant Green and Billy Gardner and Donald Bailey are holding down the groove, it's still great. You know, it's still a great blue note and really hard to find. This is a nice pressing, lovely laminated cover. Again, Grant Green always makes it worth having. But when you listen to his playing, you'll hear what I'm saying, where he's kind of trying to blow all 3 horns, and so he's getting these chords out of the 3 horns with his fingers, but it doesn't allow him the dexterous maneuvering of melodic movement. And that's just the way it is. A record that to me steps greatly outside of the blue note sound, but a record that all the same I love dearly is Gratian Moncourt's Evolution. The band is pretty outstanding with Lee Morgan, Jackie McLean, Bobby Hutcherson, Bob Cranshaw, and Tony Williams. If you listen to this, it's not swinging, it's not blues driven, it's moody, it's melancholy, but it's also brilliant. It's not painful to listen to, it's intriguing. And like I've said about the Avantgarde before, it changes what I think of. I'm not thinking about the blues and the black community and racial relations and economic divisions. This starts to speak about fighting dragons on Mordor, spaceships flying through the galaxy. The Avantgarde has an element of science fiction, mythology, soundscape, filmscape. It's picture music. It's less about feeling and more about picturescapes. And the world has room for that. You know, the world has room for all types. And as much as I've criticized the Avantgarde over the years, and said it's a movement away from jazz, I still love a lot of the advancements it brought, and think that there's a lot of really clever, brilliant playing going on. Second to last, Wayne Shorter. Shorter's a brilliant, brilliant player, a great composer, one of the great songwriters of the modern era. And if you wanted to find a figure that has defined jazz post 1965 more than Wayne Shorter, I think you'd have a tough time doing so. Most moments in jazz are defined by a player, a sound, a development, an advancement. For me, Blakey embodies the hard bop movement. He's this huge figure in the late 50s, early 60s. Shorter comes along. His first few records were on VJ, 59-60, and then he starts working for Blue Note. And of course, he also gets hired by Miles Davis, and that really puts a spotlight on young Wayne Shorter's career. But he was a brilliant arranger. And after he leaves VJ, his buddy Lee Morgan brings him over to the Jazz Messengers, where he plays with Blakey and Fuller and Morgan and the whole lineup, Bobby Timmons. And Shorter is such a brilliant writer in the context of the Jazz Messengers. He writes a lot of blistering, sharp-angled, dimensional pieces. And when he moves to the Miles group, he's allowed to do some different things again. And if you think about what's happened in modern jazz, and even a lot of the modern stuff in England right now and New York, Shorter feels like the grandfather of a lot of what's happened in music the last 30 years jazz-wise. A lot of the great playing in the 70s, the 80s, the fusion era, the just like almost without incident, I think of jazz from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, into the current stuff that I hear. Shorter feels like he's very much the grandfather seed for a lot of what modern jazz has become. And it's very compositional. It has elements of swing and the blues in it, but it's not afraid to walk away from it, to change time signature, to change angles, to have challenging harmonics. He's got some of Ellington's compositional abilities, but in a smaller group setting with a ferocity and a great amount of tension. Shorter is truly one of the great players in this music's history. And I don't speak about him enough, in part because he gets spoken about a lot. And he's still alive, he's still doing his thing. He gets plenty of credit from all the guys out there. My buddy Ken McAuliffe, jazz vinyl lover, he speaks about Wayne Shorter a lot. And so I think I've let other guys cover him. I talk about him more in a Jazz Messenger context or with Miles Davis. But his body of work as a solo artist at Blue Note is some amazing stuff. Night Dreamer, Juju, it's really impressive. And I think Herbie Hancock and him were really instrumental in making that second Miles Quintet what it was, and as forward thinking and as modern as those records still sound. Shorter's the engine behind most of that, for my money. You can't really go wrong with Wayne Shorter. He will propel you beyond the past into the future. And he kind of links what's before him and bottlenecks it all into his thing, and then it all branches out into infinite new ways. But he's not afraid to do those real angles like that. And then lastly, we're going to end with some sweetness. Soul jazz never sounds better than Stanley Turner and Stanley Turner and Shirley Scott. That's a good time. And I'm going to guess that for 100 people at random, if they were to go to a jazz show and you want to have as high a percentage of people walk out of that saying, that was outstanding, I want more, I'm going to say right now that all the great jazz out there, if you saw 100 strangers go see Shirley Scott and Stanley Turner play, that 95% of those people would walk out and be like, that was awesome. It's full of the gospel, it's full of the blues, it's full of sugary melody, it's full of all kinds of soul. It's just dripping gravy. You could soak up a Stanley Turner and Shirley Scott record with a biscuit and squeeze that shit in your mouth and live on that. It's the juice, it's the berry, it's the whole thing. Turrentine takes all that's before him, and he ignores everything that's going on around him and condenses the blues, rhythm and blues, and jazz into what soul jazz kind of is. And there's a lot of proprietors of soul jazz, a lot. But for me, Stanley Turrentine has this high level of integrity. He's a great improviser who speaks and tells stories in the legend of a Lester Young, Coleman Hawkins, Ben Webster. He's just a great put you on my knee and I'm going to tell you something. I think he's just a character. I don't listen to him enough. This is Hustlin', 4162. It puts it probably about 1964, I'm going to guess. maybe 63. He has a long string of records at Blue Note. You can see some of them there. And then he goes on to make great records at CTI and other labels as well. He's pretty omnipresent in jazz, into the 80s at least. You see his records more than you see a lot of Blue Note titles, in part because they sold well. Like Jimmy Smith, like the Three Sounds, some of these records that Turntine makes were pretty successful for Blue Note. Again, a great album cover. And then the group is rounded up by Kenny Burrell, Bob Cranshaw, and Otis Finch. And Otis Finch isn't a name I don't think I've ever said before. I don't know who Otis Finch is. Probably a soul R&B drummer, who knows. But it doesn't really matter what tracks they play. It doesn't really matter who the side men are. It's going to take you to the church. It's going to smell a bit like something's cooking. And it's always got that black, celebratory, fuck it, let's have a good time. We ain't here to talk about lynching. We ain't here to talk about poverty. We ain't here to talk about politics. We're here to gather with each other in a sense of communion and celebrate food, drink, and women. And within finding joy, in spite of your oppression, that's what freedom is. Freedom isn't clutching a gun saying, you ain't taking my gun from me because I'm free. That ain't freedom. The freedom as we define it as a nation is the freedom for business to operate unilaterally without any correction or oversight. That's not freedom. Freedom is joy. Freedom is releasing yourself from the burden of expectation. Being able to remove yourself from the pressure cooker that is life and kicking your shoes back, stinky socks and all, and having a good time. And you can make your oppressor weak in his knees when you celebrate in spite of those chains. There's just such a power in finding joy in spite of your sorrow. When you can celebrate freedom, when all those who would be a witness would say to you, you're not free, but the human spirit can't be fettered. It can't be contained. It can't be broken. And that resistance, that optimism, that hope, that sears through the body of the jazz canon. From Armstrong to Basie to Gillespie to Coltrane to Turntine to Dexter Gordon to Grant Green, the celebration of my freedom. In spite of all that's been done, in spite of all that's been said, tonight we're going to gather here. We got food. Those of us who are here have our freedom. And tonight we're going to have a good time. For 15 years, I can tell you there's little more incredible to experience than a group of black people celebrating. White people don't know. We don't know what it's like to celebrate. We don't know what it's like to put our troubles aside and to cross the River Jordan and to find the promised land even for 3 hours tonight. There's power in that. It swept me off my feet watching it and witnessing it firsthand. Playing the music of these people and watching each generation respond to not just their generation's music, but the generation before them and the generation after them. From the Shy-Lights to Talib Kweli, there's a power that black music has and houses. And Turntine is just that. He's that celebration of freedom in spite of. Shirley Scott's just that. Yeah, I'm playing in my stocking. I'm playing the organ. I don't care. I'm gonna roll my skirt up. I might have to get up and dance on the stool for a minute when Stanley goes on his break. That's the power of the black experience. That's the power of the human experience. And it's funny how throughout history, it's the most oppressed groups who are best able to quantify and define and live within freedom. It's not the writers of history who write our great texts. You know, I mean, they don't define the Lord as my shepherd. It's the people who make bricks in Babylon that could go, oh, this is what freedom is. And it's not about economics. It's not about the choice to spend or what to buy. It's about the recognition of I survived this week, and I have my community around me right now. And I think there's a lot of third world villagers who have a whole lot more freedom than any of us oppressed rat race monkey in a gerbil wheel running around incessantly talking about freedom. I'm going to leave you on that note. Y'all be blessed, y'all be safe, and by all means be thankful for the power of the jazz canon. Because 1,000 years from now, there's going to be prophets and religions coming out of this movement. This is an important time in human history. And jazz will be an ambassador of these times and of the positivity that came out of all this negativity. Y'all be blessed. I'm the Jazz Shepherd. Peace.